This is mind folded, a place where we take ideas that sit just past the edges of ordinary thinking and give them the room they need to unfold. Tonight, we're going somewhere ancient, a place where logic and mysticism haven't separated yet, where a poem written in the meter of prophecy tried to prove that the world you live in is a beautiful mistake. Here's a detail to carry with you. In the 1960s, archaeologists at the ruins of a Greek city found a portrait bust of the philosopher we're about to spend time with. The inscription didn't call him a philosopher, it called him a healer. That tension between the man who denied reality and the man who tended to bodies runs through everything that follows. Something is happening to you right now that cannot actually be happening. You're listening, your chest is rising and falling. Somewhere behind your eyes, neurons are firing in patterns that didn't exist a second ago and won't exist a second from now. Everything about this moment is different from the moment before it. That's obvious. That's the most obvious thing in the world. And about 2,500 years ago, a man used pure logic to prove it's impossible. His argument goes like this: if something changes, it has to come from somewhere. A thing that exists now but didn't exist a moment ago, where did it come from? It either came from something that already existed, or it came from nothing. But if it came from something that already existed, then it's not really new, it was already there in some form. And if it came from nothing, well, nothing isn't a thing. Nothing is the absence of all things. You can't pull something out of the absence of everything. You can't even think about nothing without turning it into something. The moment you point at it, it becomes a thing you're pointing at. So nothing can never produce anything. And if nothing new can ever come into being, then change, all change, any change is logically impossible. Reality must be a single, ungenerated, indestructible, motionless, eternal whole. That's the argument, and if you're thinking it sounds insane, you're in good company. Pretty much every philosopher who's ever lived has thought the same thing. But here's the problem: no one has ever fully refuted it. Not in 2,500 years. There's a strange way to frame the history of Western thought. You could say it all comes down to two people who disagreed about the most basic question you can ask: does anything actually change? On one side, there's Heraclitus. You've probably heard his most famous line: even if you don't know his name, you cannot step into the same river twice. Everything flows, everything is in constant motion. The universe is fire, perpetually burning and dying and burning again. Nothing stays, nothing holds. The only constant is change itself. On the other side, there's Parmenides, and Parmenides said the exact opposite: nothing changes, nothing has ever changed. The appearance of change is an illusion produced by senses that can't be trusted. Reality is one thing, and it doesn't move. Now on the surface, this looks like a clean binary: flux versus stasis, motion versus stillness, and most people, if they've heard of this debate at all, pick a side pretty quickly. Heraclitus feels right. Of course things change, look around, but there's a hidden irony buried in this fork that almost nobody talks about. Heraclitus, the philosopher of constant change, admitted that the logos, the deep law governing all that flux, never changes. The rule behind the change is permanent. Think about that for a second. The man who said everything flows built his entire philosophy on something that doesn't flow. The foundation of his system is the one thing exempt from his own principle. And Parmenides, the philosopher who proved change impossible, wrote an entire second half of his poem describing the world of appearances and change in exquisite, loving detail. He laid out a complete cosmology: stars, moon, earth, the behavior of the Milky Way. He described the illusion more thoroughly than most people describe reality. He couldn't stop cataloging the very thing he'd just proven wasn't there. So the champion of change believed in something unchanging, and the champion of stasis couldn't stop describing change. They each smuggled the other's insight into their own system, almost as if neither position could stand entirely alone. As if the truth, whatever it is, refuses to sit cleanly on one side of the fork. This isn't just an interesting footnote. Some historians call the confrontation between Parmenides and the rest of philosophy the most important moment in the history of Western thought. And that might sound like an exaggeration, but think about what the argument actually forced. It created a choice, a fork that every thinker after Parmenides has had to navigate, whether they knew it or not. The choice is this: do you trust your logic or do you trust your senses? If your eyes tell you one thing and your reasoning tells you another, which one wins? Parmenides said logic wins, always. If reason proves that change is impossible, then the sunrise you watched this morning didn't happen. Your heartbeat isn't real. The feeling of time passing is a trick your mind plays on a reality that sits perfectly still. And here's the thing that should bother you: every major scientific revolution has replayed exactly this tension. Copernicus told people the earth moves, even though no one could feel it moving. You walk outside, the ground is still, the sun crosses the sky. Every human sense says the earth is fixed, but the math said otherwise, and the math was right. Darwin told people they share ancestors with apes, and the immediate reaction wasn't just disbelief, it was disgust. It violated something deep about how people experienced their own identity, but the evidence said otherwise, and the evidence was right. Quantum mechanics tells people that particles exist in multiple states simultaneously, that a thing can be in two places at once until you look at it. That doesn't just contradict your senses, it contradicts your concept of what a thing even is. But the equations work, the predictions hold. Every time the logic said something the senses denied. Every time the logic turned out to be closer to the truth. The pattern Parmenides identified, that reality might be fundamentally different from how it appears, didn't go away. It kept getting confirmed. So when Parmenides said reality is nothing like what you experience, maybe the real question isn't whether he was right. Maybe it's whether we keep accidentally proving he was. But who was this person who makes a claim like that everything you see and hear and feel is a logical impossibility, and then goes home for dinner? Who writes the laws for a city, heals the sick, and somewhere in between argues that none of it is actually real? The answer, it turns out, is stranger than the argument itself. Parmenides didn't come from nowhere. He had a teacher, or at least someone who shaped the air he breathed. A man named Xenophanes, who'd been wandering the Greek world for decades, saying things that made people uncomfortable. Xenophanes had one big idea, and it was a dangerous one. He looked at the Greek gods, Zeus hurling thunderbolts, Aphrodite scheming over love affairs, Ares picking fights, and he said, "You made all of this up. You made your gods look like you. The Ethiopians give their gods dark skin and flat noses. The Thracians give theirs red hair and blue eyes." And then he delivered the line that would be quoted for the next 2.5 millennia. If horses had gods, their gods would look like horses. It sounds almost like a joke, but Xenophanes meant it as a demolition. If every culture invents gods in its own image, then none of those gods are real. They're mirrors, not windows. They tell you about the worshippers, not about whatever's actually out there. And if the anthropomorphic gods are fictions, what is actually out there? Xenophanes' answer was radical for his time: one God. Not a human-shaped deity sitting on a mountaintop, not a jealous father figure with a thunderbolt collection, but a single, abstract, non-anthropomorphic divinity. A God that doesn't look like anything, doesn't walk around, doesn't argue with other gods, one mind, unmoving, governing all things through thought alone. Now some scholars think Parmenides studied directly under Xenophanes. Others think the connection was less direct, more of a shared intellectual climate in the Greek colonies of southern Italy, where ideas traveled fast and thinkers seemed to feed off each other's heresies. But either way, the lineage is hard to miss. Xenophanes went from many human-shaped gods to one abstract deity, and Parmenides took the next step, from one god to one being. Not a divine mind governing the universe, but the universe itself as a single, undifferentiated whole. Theology became ontology. The question stopped being what is God like and became what is everything like, and the answer, one, unchanging, indivisible, carried over almost unchanged. The leap from monotheism to monism turns out to be shorter than it looks. But Parmenides wasn't just a thinker. This is one of the things that makes him genuinely strange as a historical figure. He was a lawgiver. Elea was a Greek colony on the southern coast of Italy, present-day Velia, if you ever wanted to look for it on a map. And Parmenides didn't just live there quietly, thinking his thoughts. He wrote its laws. According to Plutarch, the citizens of Elea swore an oath every single year to abide by the legislation Parmenides had laid down, not for a generation, not for a single century. For centuries after his death, the people of Elea organized their civic life around rules written by a man who believed, at the deepest level, that civic life wasn't real. Sit with that for a moment. You've got a man who argued that change is impossible, that all differentiation is illusion, that nothing moves, nothing is born, nothing dies. And this same man sat down and wrote detailed laws about property disputes, civic duties, the proper running of a city, activities that only make sense if things actually change. A law is a rule about how change should happen. This person holds this role until they don't. This property belongs to this family unless it transfers. Every clause assumes the reality of transitions, and the person writing those clauses had just finished proving that transitions don't exist. There's no record of Parmenides seeing a contradiction in any of this. Maybe he didn't. Maybe the world of appearances, the illusory realm he'd relegated to the second half of his poem, was where civic life happened, and he governed it the way a lucid dreamer might arrange furniture in a dream. Not because it's real, but because even illusions have a kind of structure, and that structure deserves care. Or maybe, and this is where it starts to get genuinely interesting, Parmenides wasn't the pure rationalist that later centuries made him into. In the 1960s, archaeologists excavating at the ruins of ancient Elea found something that didn't fit the standard story. A portrait bust from the 1st century CE, inscribed with his name, but the inscription didn't call Parmenides a philosopher. It connected him to a healing cult, the cult of Apollo, Ulios, Apollo the healer. The bust was found in a context that suggested Parmenides was remembered in his own city not for his metaphysics, but for some kind of medical or healing practice. A healer, the man who denied the reality of the body, who argued that physical existence is a veil over changeless being, that man may have spent part of his life treating the sick, pressing his hands against foreheads, mixing remedies, tending to bodies he believed on some fundamental level did not truly exist. It's a small detail, archaeologically speaking, one inscription on one bust, but it cracked open a door that no one expected. Because if Parmenides wasn't only a rationalist philosopher, if he was also connected to the healing traditions of Apollo, to the world of cult practice and ritual, then what was the poem, really? Was it a logical argument dressed up in mythological clothing? Or was it a record of something that actually happened to him, not an argument at all, but an experience? That door, once opened, led somewhere very dark and very quiet. In 1999, a British scholar named Peter Kingsley published a book that made a lot of classicists very uncomfortable. The book was called In the Dark Places of Wisdom, and its central argument was simple enough to state in a sentence: everything you think you know about Parmenides is wrong. The standard story, the one taught in philosophy departments for the better part of a century, goes like this. Parmenides was a rational thinker, an early logician, a man who used pure reason to reach surprising conclusions about the nature of reality. His poem is a philosophical argument wrapped in mythological imagery, because that's how Greeks of his era communicated complex ideas. The chariot, the goddess, the gates between night and day, their literary decoration, window dressing. The real content is the logic hidden underneath. Strip away the mythology, extract the propositions, and you've got Parmenides. Kingsley said no, all of that is backwards. The mythology isn't the wrapping, it's the substance. He argued that Parmenides belonged to a tradition called the iatromantes, a word that combines iatros, meaning healer, with mantis, meaning seer or prophet. The iatromantes were healer prophets who practiced something called ritual incubation. They would go into dark underground chambers, sometimes caves, sometimes purpose-built rooms beneath temples, and lie perfectly still, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, in complete darkness, in complete silence, waiting for visions. Waiting for contact with something beyond ordinary consciousness. It was a practice connected to Apollo, the god associated with healing, light, prophecy, and the boundary between the living and the dead. And it was, in Kingsley's reading, exactly what Parmenides did. Those inscriptions unearthed at Elea in the 1950s, the ones connecting Parmenides to the cult of Apollo Ulios, weren't anomalies to be explained away. They were the key to the whole thing. Parmenides wasn't a philosopher who happened to have some incidental connection to a healing cult. He was a healer prophet who happened to produce what later centuries would call philosophy. The order of operations matters. The poem wasn't a logical argument dressed in mythological clothing. It was a record of an actual experience, a vision received in darkness, in stillness, in the kind of silence that dissolves the boundaries between the self and whatever lies beneath. If Kingsley is right, and plenty of scholars disagree with him, some quite forcefully, but the archaeological evidence keeps being difficult to dismiss, then Western philosophy was born not in a lecture hall, not in a marketplace debate, not in the bright open air of Greek rationalism. It was born in a dark underground chamber by a man lying motionless with his eyes closed, waiting for something to speak to him. That's a very different origin story than the one most people carry around. And the poem itself, when you actually sit with it, doesn't read like a philosophical treatise. It reads like a journey. Parmenides wrote it in dactylic hexameter, the same rhythmic meter Homer used for the Iliad and the Odyssey. That's not a casual literary choice. In the ancient Greek world, hexameter wasn't just a poetic form among others. It was the meter of prophecy, the meter of divine speech. When the oracle at Delphi spoke, she spoke in hexameter. When Homer channeled the voices of the gods, he used hexameter. By choosing this meter for his poem, Parmenides was announcing from the very first line that what followed was not a man's opinion, not an argument, not a theory. It was revelation. The poem opens with a young man, presumably Parmenides himself, though he never names the traveler, riding a chariot pulled by mares. The daughters of the sun escort him along a road that only the knowing travel. The wheels blaze with fire. The axle screams in its socket. They ride through the air toward a massive gate, the gate that separates night from day. It's sensory and vivid in a way that arguments rarely are. You can almost hear the wheels, feel the heat, sense the acceleration. This isn't someone explaining a concept. This is someone describing what it felt like to go somewhere. And the destination follows a pattern that scholars recognized as ancient even by Parmenides' standards. The poem begins at the house of night and moves toward the light. In Greek mythology, the house of night sits at the threshold of the underworld, the place you go when you die, or the place you visit if you're brave enough and return changed. Scholars call this story structure a katabasis, a descent to the realm of the dead and a return. It's the same narrative shape found in the Orphic mystery rites, where initiates symbolically died and were reborn with access to secret knowledge. It's the same shape Virgil used centuries later when Aeneas descended to the underworld to learn his destiny. It's the shape Dante borrowed when he walked through hell and purgatory to reach paradise. If this reading holds, then Parmenides' philosophical argument wasn't merely embedded in a mythological frame. It was embedded in the oldest story template human beings have ever told, the journey through death to knowledge. You go down into darkness. You encounter something you weren't supposed to see. You lose your bearings, maybe lose yourself, and you come back carrying a truth that the waking world doesn't want to hear. That's the context. That's how this poem should be heard, not as a professor explaining a theory at a podium. As a man who went somewhere dark and quiet, met someone who told him the truth about everything, and came back to describe what she said. So the chariot arrives at the gate, and the gate has a keeper. Her name is Dyke Justice. In Greek mythology, Dike was one of the Horai, the Hours, the same divine figures Homer placed at the gates of Mount Olympus, the ones who opened and closed the cloud gates to let the gods through. She's not a minor character in the poem. She's a threshold guardian, and her presence here says something important about what kind of truth lies on the other side. Because Parmenides could have chosen anyone to guard the gate, he could have put Athena there, wisdom. He could have put Aletheia, truth itself. Instead, he chose justice. And that choice implies something that sounds almost strange to modern ears, that access to the deepest truth isn't purely intellectual, it's moral. The gate doesn't open for anyone who's clever enough. It opens for those who approach rightly. You don't figure your way past Dike, you earn your way past her. This is a very different picture of knowledge than the one we're used to. Modern philosophy and science tend to treat truth as something public, accessible, impersonal. If the logic checks out, anyone can follow it regardless of who they are. But here, at the very beginning of the Western philosophical tradition, the gateway to truth is guarded by a moral test. The implication is that certain truths aren't available to everyone. Not because they're too complicated, but because some truths require a certain quality of approach, a certain readiness, and the goddess of justice is the one who decides whether you're ready. The daughters of the sun coax Dike with gentle words, the poem tells us, not arguments, not credentials, gentle words. The bolts slide back, the great doors swing open with a groan, bronze pivots turning in their sockets, and the chariot passes through into whatever lies beyond. There's something about the form of this poem that scholars have argued about for decades, and it's worth pausing on, because the poem doesn't just describe a mystical experience. Some scholars believe it was designed to produce one. The hexameter rhythm, that da-da-da, pulse that Homer used, that the oracle at Delphi spoke in, isn't just a literary convention. It's a physiological thing. A steady, repetitive rhythm does something to the brain. It slows breathing, it narrows focus. Anyone who's ever been lulled by the sound of a train on tracks or a song with a hypnotic beat knows what this feels like. The ancient Greeks knew it too. Hexameter was the rhythm of prophecy, partly because it put people in a receptive state. And Parmenides loaded his hexameter with specific techniques that amplify the effect. Key phrases repeat. Images layer on top of each other, the blazing wheels, the screaming axle, the veils lifting. The sensory details are almost uncomfortably vivid. Fire and sound and motion, building and building, until the gates open and everything suddenly goes quiet. If you read the poem aloud in Greek in the original rhythm, some scholars say you can feel it working on you. The repetition, the cadence, the mounting intensity followed by sudden stillness. It's not describing a trance, it's inducing one. Which means the poem may have been a technology, not a metaphor for a technology, an actual one. A piece of rhythmic language engineered to take the listener to the same place the narrator went, not explaining the journey, recreating it. And if you think about where you are right now, lying still in the dark or the near dark, listening to a steady voice, you're closer to the poem's original audience than you might realize. And then the young man reaches the goddess. She's never named, just called the goddess, or sometimes she. And the first thing she does is make a promise. She tells the young man that she's going to teach him two things. The first is what she calls the unshaken heart of well-rounded truth. That word, well-rounded, like a sphere, will come back later in a way that matters. But for now, notice the confidence, not probable truth or my best guess, the unshaken heart of it. The center that doesn't move. The second thing she promises to teach is the opinions of mortals, in which there is no genuine trustworthiness. She's going to explain what ordinary people believe about the world, about change, about motion, about birth and death, and she's going to label all of it from the outset as untrustworthy. Before she's even started the argument, she's already told you the verdict. Everything your senses report is wrong. This is worth sitting with, because what the goddess is about to do has never been done before, not in any text that survives. She's going to take pure deductive logic and use it to override the entire testimony of human experience. She's going to prove, through reason alone, that the world as you know it cannot exist. And she's going to present that proof not as one perspective among many, not as a hypothesis to be tested, but as the unshaken truth, the kind of truth that doesn't bend. This is arguably the founding gesture of Western rationalism, not Socrates in the marketplace, not Aristotle cataloging specimens. This, the moment a divine voice told a mortal, I don't care what your eyes tell you, I don't care what your ears tell you, I don't care what every moment of your lived experience seems to confirm. Logic says otherwise, and logic wins. It's a strange origin for rationalism when you think about it. Pure reason, the tool that would eventually become science, it was first deployed not by a skeptic, but by a goddess. Not in a debate, but in a revelation. The most rational argument in the history of ancient thought was delivered inside the most mythological container imaginable. The young man is standing in front of the goddess. The gate of justice is behind him. The world of mortal opinion is about to be dismantled. And what she says next will rearrange everything. The goddess speaks, and the first thing she says is one of the most provocative sentences in the history of human thought. For thinking and being are the same thing. Let that sit for a moment. Not thinking reveals being, or thinking is a way to access being. Thinking and being are the same thing, identical, not two activities that happen to align, one activity viewed from two angles. The implications are immediate and vast. If thinking and being are identical, then you cannot think of what does not exist. Try it right now. Try to think of absolute nothingness, not darkness, not emptiness, not a void, not the space between stars, but genuine nothing. No properties, no location, no dimensions, the complete absence of anything at all. The moment you try, something strange happens. You've made it something. You've turned nothing into an object of thought, a concept with a shape, a word with 3 syllables, a target for your attention. And if it's an object of thought, then by Parmenides' logic, it exists in some form. The very act of thinking about nothing gives it a kind of being. The attempt to conceive of non-existence is self-defeating. You can't do it without making it exist. And the reverse is equally radical. If thinking and being are identical, then anything that can genuinely be thought must exist. If you can conceive of it clearly and fully, it is. The boundary between what's real and what's thinkable doesn't just blur, it disappears entirely. There is no thought without a corresponding reality, and no reality that escapes the reach of thought. 21 centuries later, a French philosopher sitting by a stove would echo this entanglement from the opposite direction. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. He started from thinking and derived being. Parmenides started from being and derived thinking. They arrived at the same knot, pulled from different ends. The difference is that Descartes used it to prove that he, personally, existed. Parmenides used it to prove that everything exists, permanently, unchangingly, all at once, and that non-existence is literally unthinkable. From this foundation, the goddess builds her case. She lays out what scholars have come to call the signposts of being, a list of attributes that describe what reality must be like, given the premises, and the list is extraordinary. Being is ungenerated, it was never born. It didn't come into existence at some point, because that would require it to have emerged from non-being, and non-being, as we've just established, can't exist. So being has always been here, always. Being is imperishable. It cannot die or dissolve or fade away, because that would mean it goes into non-being, and non-being is impossible. So being will always be here, always. Being is whole, not divided, not partitioned into separate things, because if there were divisions, there would need to be something between the parts, and what would be between them? Non-being, which doesn't exist, so being is one continuous whole. Being is of a single kind. There's no variety, no differentiation. Because differentiation would require some parts to have qualities that other parts lack, and lacking a quality is a form of non-being. So being is uniform throughout. Being is unmoving. Motion requires a place to move to that's different from where you are, but all places are equally filled with being. There's no gap, no void, no somewhere else to move into. So nothing moves, nothing can move. Being is complete, not lacking anything, not progressing toward a better state, not working on becoming something it isn't yet. It is, right now, everything it will ever be. 6 attributes: ungenerated, imperishable, whole, single, unmoving, complete. They don't read like the conclusions of an argument, they read like a hymn. There's something almost liturgical about the way the goddess delivers them, each one hammering the same nail deeper, each one closing another exit from the room. You can't escape through time because being was never born and will never die. You can't escape through space because being has no gaps and no divisions. You can't escape through motion because there's nowhere to go. You can't escape through change because everything is already complete. Every door is locked, and behind every lock is the same reason: non-being is impossible. Now here's something curious. Read that list again and ask yourself where you've heard something like it before. Eternal, indestructible, indivisible, unchanging, perfect. Those are the attributes that monotheistic religions would later assign to God. Parmenides, writing 5 centuries before Christianity, essentially drafted the job description for a deity he never named. His being has no personality, no will, no voice, but it has every quality that believers across 3 major religions would eventually attribute to the divine. The resonance is either a coincidence or a clue about how deep this intuition runs. And then the goddess gives being a shape. She describes it as equally balanced from the center in every direction. A perfect sphere. Finite, it has limits, but symmetrical, complete, the same everywhere you look at it from. This is, as far as anyone can tell, the first time in human history that someone used geometric language to describe the fundamental nature of reality. Not the shape of a building or a field or a celestial body, the shape of existence itself. 25 centuries later, physicists would model the universe as a 4-dimensional spacetime manifold, using geometric concepts, curvature, topology, symmetry, as the basic vocabulary for describing what reality is made of. They arrived there through centuries of mathematics and observation. Parmenides arrived there through pure thought in a poem delivered by a goddess inside a dream. The argument is complete. Being is one, being is still, being is everything. And the world you think you live in, the world of sunsets and conversations and the slow tick of clocks, is, according to this goddess, not real. You're inside the sphere. You've always been inside the sphere, and nothing inside it has ever moved. It's a strange feeling if you really let the argument land, not frightening exactly, more like vertigo. The ground doesn't disappear, it was never separate from you to begin with. Everything is right where it's always been, it just stops moving. But then Parmenides does something no one expects. Having proved that the world is an illusion, having constructed the most airtight denial of appearances in the history of human thought, he turns around and describes that illusion in painstaking, loving detail. But what Parmenides built was more than an argument, it was a method, a way of doing philosophy that was, in its own terms, the exact opposite of what we now call science. The school Parmenides founded at Elea, what scholars call the Eleatic school, operated on a principle that would seem almost perverse to a modern researcher. They didn't observe the world and draw conclusions from what they saw. They started from pure logical principles and then declared that any observation contradicting those principles must be an illusion. If logic says motion is impossible and your eyes see a bird fly across the sky, the problem isn't with the logic. The problem is with your eyes. This sounds extreme, it is extreme, but sit with it for a moment because there's something in it that isn't as crazy as it sounds. Parmenides was, in a sense, the first person to seriously propose that reality might be fundamentally different from how it appears. That the surface of things, the colors, the motions, the sounds, might be a kind of display, and that the truth underneath might look nothing like the display at all. 2,000 years later, Plato would build his entire philosophy around a version of this idea, the cave allegory, where prisoners mistake shadows for reality. And modern physics has essentially confirmed it. At the quantum level, reality looks nothing like what our senses report. Parmenides' method was wrong in its details, but right in its instinct. So the goddess has delivered the truth. Being is one, motionless, eternal. Change is impossible. That's the way of truth, aletheia in Greek. And then comes the second part of the poem, the much longer second part, the part that makes no sense. It's called the Way of Opinion, doxa, and in it the goddess lays out a complete cosmology, not a sketch, not a casual aside, a detailed account of how the universe works, built on two opposing principles, light and night, or fire and darkness, two forces intertwined, generating everything you see. She describes the origin of the stars, the behavior of the sun and moon, the nature of the Milky Way, the structure of the earth. She describes a cosmos governed by opposing forces, a universe of change and motion and differentiation, exactly the kind of universe she just finished proving doesn't exist. And she doesn't present it neutrally. Before she starts, she explicitly labels the whole thing, deceptive, untrustworthy. These are the opinions of mortals, she says. This is what people believe, and none of it is genuinely true. But then she goes ahead and describes it anyway, in detail, with care, with what sometimes reads as genuine fascination. At the center of this deceptive cosmos, she places a figure, a goddess who steers all things. Some scholars identify this steering goddess with Aphrodite. Others think she's Anank necessity, the force that binds everything to its fate. Either way, she sits at the center, governing birth and death and desire, driving the illusion of change from the inside out. Love or fate, or maybe both, at the heart of a cosmos that isn't real. It's a strange and beautiful picture, a universe of light and darkness, steered by love or necessity, vividly described by someone who insists it's all a lie. And here's the puzzle that scholars have argued about for 25 centuries, and nobody has solved. Why did he bother? If the way of opinion is false, if Parmenides genuinely believed that change is impossible and the physical world is an illusion, why did he spend the majority of his poem describing that illusion in loving, systematic detail? The Way of Truth takes up maybe 40 lines of surviving text. The Way of Opinion was far longer. He gave far more space to the lie than to the truth. There are theories, and they're worth hearing, because each one says something different about what kind of thinker Parmenides really was. Some scholars think The Way of Opinion was a kind of field guide to the illusion. Here's how the false world works, so you can navigate it while knowing it isn't real. A practical concession. You may live in a dream, but you still need to function within it. Even a man who knows the world is unreal still has to eat breakfast and walk to the market. The Way of Opinion tells you how to do that intelligently. Others think Parmenides was doing something more subtle. Maybe The Way of Opinion is the best account of the world of appearances that mortal reasoning can produce, flawed, but as good as our limited minds can manage. The goddess isn't saying, here's how things are. She's saying, here's the best you can do, given the constraints of mortal perception. And some scholars think the tension is the point, that Parmenides knew, maybe even intended, that the two halves of his poem would sit in unresolvable conflict, that the poem is not a treatise with a clear conclusion but a performance of a paradox. The world you live in is an illusion, and you can't stop describing it. Nobody knows which reading is right. The poem won't tell us. Too much of it is lost. We have fragments, not a complete text, and the fragments don't resolve the question. They deepen it. But the tension between the two halves, between the logical proof that nothing changes and the loving, meticulous description of a changing world, that tension is one of the most productive contradictions in the history of thought. It didn't just sit there as a puzzle. It became a crack in the foundation, and through that crack, everything else would eventually pour. And one of the strangest things about The Way of Opinion, the part that was supposed to be the lie, is that it contained some remarkably accurate observations about the actual world. Here's something that shouldn't make sense, given everything we've just heard. The man who said the physical world was an illusion turned out to be one of its most perceptive observers. Somewhere in the way of opinion, the part of the poem the goddess herself labeled deceptive, Parmenides included an observation about the moon. He appears to have been the first person in recorded history to figure out that the moon doesn't generate its own light. It shines by reflecting sunlight. That seems like a small thing now. We learn it in elementary school, but in the 5th century BCA, it was a significant intellectual leap. Most people looked at the moon and saw a glowing object, something that produced light the way the sun did, just dimmer. Parmenides looked at the same moon and reasoned that the light had to come from somewhere else. He deduced something about the physical world that you can't directly see. You can't watch the sunlight bouncing off the lunar surface purely through inference. And the irony is thick. This is exactly the kind of observation that the Eleatic method should dismiss. It's about the physical world. It's about change, the moon waxing and waning as its angle to the sun shifts. It's about appearances. And yet Parmenides made the observation with precision. He laid the groundwork for Anaxagoras, who would later use geometric reasoning to explain the phases of the moon and predict eclipses. The chain of understanding that would eventually let human beings land on the moon started, in part, with a man who denied the moon was real. But it didn't stop there. Parmenides may also have been the first thinker to propose that the earth is a sphere. Diogenes Laertius attributed this claim to him, and if the attribution is right, Parmenides beat Pythagoras and Aristotle to one of the most fundamental insights in the history of geography. He didn't just say the earth was round. He reportedly divided it into 5 climatic zones, 2 polar zones, 2 temperate zones, and a tropical zone in between. That's not a rough guess. That's a system, and it's remarkably close to the zonal classification geographers still use today, 25 centuries later. Think about that for a moment. 5 climatic zones derived through reasoning alone in an era when no one had ever traveled from the Arctic to the equator. No satellite imagery, no thermometers, just a mind looking at the angles of sunlight and thinking through what those angles would mean at different positions on a sphere. It's the kind of insight that makes you wonder whether the Eleatic method, start from reason, ignore appearances, was actually more productive than it had any right to be. So you've got a man who argued that the physical world is a complete illusion, that nothing in it truly exists, that change and motion are logical impossibilities, and this same man correctly identified the source of moonlight, proposed a spherical Earth, and mapped out climate zones that we still recognize as basically accurate. The philosopher of illusion made some of the most real predictions in all of antiquity. Maybe that's what the way of opinion was for, not a casual afterthought but a demonstration. Even within the illusion, Parmenides seemed to say there are patterns worth understanding. Even inside a dream, some observations are sharper than others. The world may not be real, but it's not random. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe Parmenides was just curious. Maybe the man who denied the world's reality couldn't help being fascinated by it. We'll never know for certain because most of what Parmenides wrote is gone. Out of an estimated 800 lines in the original poem, only about 160 survive. Roughly 20%, 4/5 of the poem, including almost all of the way of opinion, has been lost. What we have, we owe almost entirely to later authors who quoted Parmenides in their own works. A line here, a passage there, preserved not because anyone set out to save the poem, but because other thinkers found individual passages useful for their own arguments. The single most important preserver was a man named Simplicius, a Neoplatonist philosopher writing in the 6th century CE, a full 1,000 years after Parmenides lived. Simplicius happened to possess a good copy of the poem, and he quoted from it extensively in his commentaries on Aristotle, not because he was trying to save Parmenides for posterity. He was trying to explain Aristotle. Parmenides was a footnote, a counterpoint, a piece of evidence in someone else's argument. But those quotations turned out to be the life raft. Without Simplicius and his copy and his habit of quoting at length, we would have lost Parmenides almost entirely. The most important philosophical argument of the ancient world would have vanished, not destroyed, not burned, just gradually forgotten, one generation at a time, until the last copy crumbled. It's a fragile thread, 160 lines carried across 1,000 years by a chain of quotations, saved by a commentator who was writing about someone else. Think about all the things that had to go right. Simplicius had to have a copy. He had to decide those passages were worth quoting. His own books had to survive through the fall of Rome, through centuries of copying and recopying by hand, through fires and floods and the slow entropy of parchment. Any number of small accidents could have erased Parmenides completely, and we would never have known what we'd lost. There would just be a gap in the story, references to a thinker whose work no one could read, an argument everyone talked about but nobody could quote. But the fragments did survive, and those 160 lines were enough, because the argument, even in pieces, was irresistible. Every thinker who encountered it was forced to respond, not could respond, had to. Philosophers have a name for what happened after Parmenides. They call it the Parmenidean challenge. It sounds academic, but the reality was more like an earthquake. Parmenides had produced a logical proof so tight, so internally consistent, that no one could simply ignore it. You couldn't just say, well, obviously things change and move on, because Parmenides had anticipated that response and explained exactly why it fails. His argument didn't need you to agree with its conclusion. It only needed you to accept its premises, and the premises were hard to deny. Something can't come from nothing. You can't think about what doesn't exist. These aren't exotic claims. They sound reasonable, obvious even. The problem is that they lead, by strict logical steps, to a conclusion that denies the reality of everything you experience. So every major Greek philosopher who came after Parmenides was forced to respond, not because they wanted to talk about Parmenides, because they couldn't talk about anything else until they dealt with him. Want to build a theory of nature, you need to explain how change is possible, given that Parmenides proved it isn't. Want to talk about ethics or politics or the nature of knowledge, you need a world where things happen, where people act, where outcomes differ. And Parmenides says none of that is real. Plato's theory of forms, Aristotle's potentiality and actuality, Democritus' atomism, Empedocles' four elements, every one of these was, in some way, an attempt to rescue the reality of change without violating the core Parmenidean insight that something can't come from nothing. The entire subsequent history of Greek philosophy is, in a sense, a long argument with a man who said the argument was pointless because nothing ever changes. The first responders, though, weren't trying to escape Parmenides. They were trying to defend him. The most famous was Zeno of Elea, Parmenides' student, possibly his lover. Ancient sources are ambiguous, and certainly his most brilliant advocate. But Zeno's strategy was unusual. He didn't try to prove that Parmenides was right. Instead, he attacked the opposing position. His method was devastatingly simple. If you believe in motion and change and plurality, let me show you what follows. And what follows, Zeno demonstrated, is absurdity. His most famous paradox is the one about Achilles and the tortoise. Give a tortoise a head start in a race against Achilles, the fastest runner in Greek mythology. By the time Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise started, the tortoise has moved a little further ahead. By the time Achilles reaches that new point, the tortoise has moved again, and again, and again. There's always a gap. The gap keeps shrinking, but it never reaches zero. Achilles, logically, can never catch the tortoise. Now, of course, in real life, Achilles catches the tortoise easily. That's the point. Zeno wasn't confused about how foot races work. He was demonstrating something about the logic of motion. If you try to analyze motion rationally, if you break it down into its logical components, you get contradictions. You get infinite series that don't converge. You get results that directly contradict what your eyes tell you. In other words, the same problem Parmenides identified. Logic and experience don't agree, and Zeno's move was to say, don't blame Parmenides for that, blame reality. And Zeno had more. A flying arrow is motionless. At every instant, it occupies a space equal to its own length, and something occupying a space equal to its own length isn't moving, it's resting. So at every moment of its flight, the arrow is at rest. When does it move? Zeno's answer, it doesn't. These paradoxes weren't puzzles for entertainment. They weren't brain teasers for dinner parties. They were weapons, designed specifically to make anyone who believed in change feel the same logical vertigo that Parmenides' argument created. You think the world moves? Fine, explain how. Show me the logic, because every time you try, you end up somewhere impossible. And here's what makes Zeno genuinely significant beyond the paradoxes themselves, his method. He was one of the first thinkers in history to use what philosophers now call reductio ad absurdum, taking your opponent's position, following it to its logical conclusion, and showing that the conclusion is absurd. He didn't need to prove that Parmenides was right. He just needed to prove that the alternative was worse. That's a surprisingly modern form of argument. Scientists and mathematicians still use it every day. But not everyone who followed Parmenides preserved his vision intact. One of his most devoted followers, Melissus of Samos, modified the doctrine in a way that Parmenides himself would probably have rejected. Parmenides described being as finite, a perfect sphere with limits. The metaphor of the sphere was central to his vision, something symmetrical, balanced, complete, bounded. Melissus looked at that picture and saw a problem. If being has a boundary, what's on the other side of the boundary? If there's something beyond the edge of the sphere, then there are two things, and being isn't truly one. And if there's nothing beyond the boundary, well, nothing is non-being, and non-being doesn't exist. So the boundary can't be there. Being must be infinite. It's a clever argument, and it uses Parmenides' own logic against Parmenides' own conclusion. The student took the teacher's method and applied it to the teacher's metaphor, and the metaphor crumbled. If being is infinite and unbounded, then it can't be a sphere. The most vivid image in Parmenides' entire poem, reality as a perfect, finite ball, equally balanced from the center in every direction, turns out to be, by the teacher's own logic, impossible. The defenders held the line, but they also, in holding it, revealed its cracks. And meanwhile, across the Greek world, the escape artists were already working. While Zeno was defending Parmenides and Melissus was modifying him, a different group of thinkers was trying something more ambitious. They accepted Parmenides' premise, nothing can come from nothing, and then engineered workarounds, ways to save the reality of change without violating the logic that said it was impossible. The first solution came from Empedocles, and it was elegant enough to shape chemistry for the next 2,000 years. Empedocles agreed that you can't create something from nothing. He agreed that genuine creation, bringing into existence something that had no prior being at all, is logically impossible. But he found a loophole. What if nothing is ever truly created or destroyed? What if the things we call new are actually just rearrangements of things that already exist? He proposed 4 eternal, unchanging roots, what we'd later call elements: earth, water, air, and fire. These roots never come into being and never pass away. They just are. In that sense, they're perfectly Parmenidean. Each one is indestructible, unchanging in its fundamental nature, a little piece of eternal being. And this is the crucial move: they mix. 2 cosmic forces drive the mixing, love and strife. Love draws the elements together into combinations. Strife pulls them apart. A tree is a particular combination of earth, water, air, and fire held together by love. When the tree dies and decays, strife separates the elements and they recombine into something else. Nothing is created, nothing is destroyed. Things just combine and come apart endlessly. It's the rearrangement loophole. Change isn't real creation, it's shuffling. The deck has a fixed number of cards. No cards are ever added or removed, but the hand you're dealt keeps changing. And the thing is, this framework worked. Not perfectly, not in its details, but as a basic model of how the physical world operates, it was astonishingly productive. The idea that a small number of fundamental, indestructible elements combine and recombine to produce the diversity of the world, that's the backbone of chemistry. Empedocles' four roots were eventually replaced by the periodic table, but the underlying logic is the same. Nothing is truly created or destroyed. Everything is rearrangement. Parmenides said you can't get something from nothing, and Empedocles' answer was, so don't, work with what you have. The second escape came from Anaxagoras, and it invented something much bigger than it intended to. Anaxagoras agreed that the material world couldn't produce change on its own. If everything is just stuff, earth, water, air, fire, or whatever the mixture is, then what makes the stuff move? What initiates the first combination? Empedocles had love and strife, but those were basically forces embedded within the material world. Anaxagoras wanted something cleaner, something separate. He introduced nous, mind, cosmic intelligence, the one thing in the universe that isn't part of the material mixture, that stands apart from it, that can initiate motion and impose order on what would otherwise be motionless chaos. Nous is what starts the rotation. Nous is what sorts the mixture into recognizable things. Nous is the engine. And here's what's remarkable about that. Anaxagoras had just invented, for the first time in Western philosophy, the idea that mind is fundamentally different from matter. Before him, nobody had drawn that line. The world was stuff, and thinking was just something the stuff did. Anaxagoras said no, mind is separate. Mind is not material. Mind is the one thing that can act on matter without being part of it. That distinction, mind separate from matter, would become the most consequential binary in the history of Western thought. 2,000 years later, Descartes would build his entire philosophy around it. The mind-body problem, the hard problem of consciousness, the question of how something immaterial can affect something physical. All of it traces back to a man who was just trying to escape Parmenides' trap. Parmenides said change is impossible. Anaxagoras responded by inventing consciousness as a philosophical category. The third escape was the most audacious of all, and it came from the atomists Leucippus and Democritus. They did something that nobody else had dared to do. They accepted almost everything Parmenides said. Being can't come from non-being, agreed. Nothing can be created or destroyed, absolutely. Being is indestructible, eternal, unchanging. Yes, all of that. But then they broke the one rule that Parmenides said could never be broken. They said the void exists, non-being is real. Their argument went like this: if everything is a single, undifferentiated whole with no gaps, then there's no room for motion. Nothing can move because there's nowhere to move to. Parmenides was right about that, but what if there are gaps? What if being isn't continuous but comes in tiny, indivisible pieces, atoms, with empty space between them? The atoms themselves are perfectly Parmenidean. Each one is eternal, unchanging, indestructible, little pellets of pure being. But the space between them is nothing, the void, what is not. To make this work, Leucippus and Democritus had to embrace the most scandalous claim in Parmenides' framework, that nothingness exists, that what is not somehow is. The void has no properties, no substance, no being in the Parmenidean sense, and yet it's there, between the atoms, making motion possible. It was a breathtaking piece of philosophical judo. They used Parmenides' own logic to construct Parmenidean building blocks, atoms, and then place them in the one thing Parmenides had explicitly forbidden, emptiness. Change became possible, not because being comes from non-being, but because eternal, unchanging pieces of being rearrange themselves in a void that shouldn't exist. These were the escape artists. Each one bowed to Parmenides' logic while finding a way around his conclusion. But none of them confronted the argument head-on. They built workarounds, not refutations, and the argument was still standing. The escape artists built workarounds, but the two biggest names in all of Greek philosophy, the two who still dominate every introductory class taught anywhere in the world, tried something different. They went after the argument directly. Aristotle opened his Physics, arguably the founding text of natural science, the book that would set the agenda for every investigation of the natural world for the next 2,000 years, by dismantling Parmenides' argument. Not dismissing it, dismantling it. He treated it with the kind of care you'd give a loaded weapon, because that's essentially what it was. An argument that, if left intact, made all of natural science impossible. Aristotle's key move was a single distinction, and it's one of those ideas that seems obvious once you hear it, which is a good sign that it's genuinely important. He said, Parmenides only sees two options. Something either fully is or it fully is not, being or non-being, existence or nothingness, but what about the space between? Think about an acorn. An acorn is not an oak tree, that's clear enough. But is an acorn nothing? Is it non-being? Of course not. An acorn is something, it's an acorn, it has weight, it has a shell. You can hold it in your hand, but it's also in a very specific sense a potential oak tree. Not an oak yet, but not nothing either. It's something on its way to becoming something else. It occupies a space that Parmenides' system didn't have room for. It exists, but it exists as a possibility, not yet as a fulfillment. Aristotle called this potentiality, and with that single concept he cracked open the Parmenidean trap. A thing doesn't come from pure non-being, that would violate Parmenides' logic, and Aristotle agreed it should be violated. But a thing also doesn't come from something that already fully is. It comes from something that potentially is. The acorn becomes the oak not by leaping from nothingness into being, but by actualizing what was already there in potential form. It sounds simple, and in a way it is, but this one distinction, potentiality and actuality, became the backbone of Western metaphysics for the next 2,000 years. It gave philosophers a way to talk about change without breaking Parmenides' rule. Change isn't creation from nothing. Change is the actualization of potential. And that framework shaped everything from medieval theology to modern developmental biology. The idea that things develop, that they unfold toward their mature form, that an embryo is already in some sense the animal it will become, that's Aristotle's answer to Parmenides. Born specifically to solve one problem, how can change be real if nothing comes from nothing? But Aristotle's relationship with Parmenides was relatively straightforward. Respect the problem, solve the problem, move on. Plato's relationship was something else entirely. Plato wrote a dialogue, the Parmenides, in which he staged a dramatic encounter between a 65-year-old Parmenides and a 20-year-old Socrates. The meeting probably never happened, at least not in the way Plato describes it, but the fiction tells us something important about how Plato saw the relationship between his own philosophy and its ancestor. In the dialogue, young Socrates presents his theory of forms, the idea that behind every particular beautiful thing there is a form of beauty, behind every particular just act there is a form of justice, and so on. It's Plato's most famous doctrine, the one everybody learns in Philosophy 101, and the old Parmenides proceeds to destroy it. 5 devastating arguments, one after another, each exposing a logical problem that Socrates can't answer. The young man is overmatched. He can't defend his own theory. But then something strange happens. After demolishing the theory of forms, Parmenides tells Socrates, "You're right, the theory is correct in spirit. You just haven't been sufficiently exercised in dialectic, in the art of rigorous argument, to defend it properly yet. Keep working, you'll get there." It's an extraordinary moment. The old philosopher destroys the young one's argument and then tells him to keep believing in it anyway. The message seems to be, the insight is correct, but the thinking isn't sharp enough yet. You need Parmenides' level of logical rigor to defend Plato's level of metaphysical vision. And then in a later dialogue, the sophist Plato took the step he'd been dreading. A character called the Eleatic stranger announces that he must commit what he calls patricide. He must kill Father Parmenides. Not literally, of course, philosophically, because Parmenides had said that what is not cannot be. And if what is not cannot be, then there's no such thing as falsehood. There's no such thing as error. If you can't speak of what isn't, then every statement is equally true, and meaningful disagreement becomes impossible. Philosophy itself, the practice of arguing about what's true and what's false, collapses. To save philosophy from that silence, Plato had to prove that non-being is, in some sense, real. He had to let what is not back into the picture, and to do that, he had to symbolically kill the man he revered as philosophy's father. It's one of the most dramatic moments in the history of ideas. A student acknowledging his deepest debt to a teacher, and then, with visible reluctance, with the kind of care you take when you know you're breaking something you love, demonstrating that the teacher's most important conclusion must be wrong, not because it's poorly argued, not because there's a flaw in the logic, but because its consequences are unlivable. A world where you can't speak of what isn't is a world where you can't distinguish truth from falsehood, and that's a world where thinking itself becomes pointless. Plato killed the father, or tried to, but the thing about Parmenides' argument is that it kept getting up. The ancient world never stopped wrestling with it. Empedocles rearranged around it. Aristotle introduced potentiality to outflank it. Plato committed symbolic patricide to save philosophy from its consequences. Each solution worked in its own way for its own purposes, but none of them erased the original argument. The proof was still there, still internally consistent, still waiting for anyone brave enough or foolish enough to take it at face value. And the argument sat there waiting, not defeated, not fully accepted, just waiting for whoever would be brave enough to look at it next. Not everyone who came after Parmenides tried to work around him or dismantle him with careful logical distinctions. Some of them just attacked. The most entertaining attack came from a man named Gorgias of Leontini, a sophist, which in ancient Greece meant a professional teacher of rhetoric and persuasion, someone who made a living by being brilliant with words. Gorgias wrote a work called On Nature, or On the Non-Existent, and what he did with it was both devastating and hard to pin down. He took Parmenides' own method, strict logical deduction from first principles, and turned it inside out. His argument had 3 steps, each one more outrageous than the last. First, nothing exists. Second, even if something exists, it cannot be known by human beings. Third, even if it can be known, it cannot be communicated from one person to another. It's the mirror image of Parmenides. Where Parmenides proved that being is everything, Gorgias proved that being is nothing. Same logical tools, same style of argument, opposite conclusion. And nobody has ever figured out whether Gorgias was serious. Was he genuinely arguing that nothing exists, or was he performing a virtuoso display of what rhetoric can do, showing that the same method Parmenides used to prove everything can just as easily prove nothing? Either way, the point was sharp. If your logical method can reach any conclusion, including the denial of all existence, then maybe the method itself isn't as trustworthy as Parmenides thought. Gorgias was playing, but the next great critic was deadly serious. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in the 19th century, admired Parmenides' audacity but thought he caught him cheating. In Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, Nietzsche made an accusation that's hard to shake once you hear it. He said, Parmenides, pure logic isn't pure at all. It's disguised autobiography. The accusation goes like this. Where did Parmenides get his concept of being? He says he derived it from pure reason. But Nietzsche argued that the concept actually came from somewhere much more intimate, from the subjective experience of being alive, the feeling of existing, the sensation of breathing, of awareness, of I am here. Parmenides took that private, bodily, first-person experience and projected it outward. He inflated a personal sensation into a cosmic truth. I breathe, therefore being exists, and then he dressed it up in logical deduction to make it look impersonal and universal. It's a clever attack and it hits something real. There's always been a question lurking beneath Parmenides' argument. Where does the concept of being come from in the first place? You can't derive it from nothing, that would violate the argument itself, so it has to come from somewhere. and Nietzsche's suggestion is that it comes from the one thing no philosopher can escape, being a living body in a world that feels real. If Nietzsche is right, then Parmenides' great proof, the cold, impersonal proof that reality is one, is actually a very personal poem after all. A man describing what it feels like to exist and calling it the structure of the universe. And there's something fitting about that accusation, given what we know about the poem itself. It was, after all, a first-person account of a visionary experience, a man in a chariot being told the truth by a goddess. Nietzsche's point is that the vision and the argument were never really separate. The philosophical claim grew out of the personal experience, and the logical armor was added later to make it look like it hadn't. But the most consequential modern reading of Parmenides came from someone who thought everyone had been misreading him from the start. Martin Heidegger, arguably the most influential philosopher of the 20th century, a man whose own writing is so dense and layered that entire academic careers have been spent trying to decode single paragraphs, considered Parmenides the pivotal figure in all of Western thought. Not one thinker among many, the thinker, the hinge on which everything turned. Heidegger's argument was that Parmenides had glimpsed something real and profound, an insight about being, about what it means for anything to exist at all, and that every philosopher since had progressively buried that insight under layers of abstraction. The goddess in the poem wasn't talking about logical categories, Heidegger said. She was talking about aletheia, a Greek word usually translated as truth, but which Heidegger insisted means unconcealment, the revealing of something that was hidden. The experience of reality showing itself. For Heidegger, Parmenides wasn't making an abstract argument about whether change is possible. He was describing an encounter with being itself, a direct, preconceptual experience of what it means for something to exist. And the tragedy of Western philosophy, in Heidegger's view, is that it took this living encounter and turned it into a set of propositions, a series of logical claims that could be argued for and against. It took an experience and made it into a theory. And in doing so, it lost the thing Parmenides was actually pointing at. The reading is controversial. Many scholars think Heidegger was projecting his own obsessions onto an ancient text that can't defend itself. Fair enough. But Heidegger did something important regardless of whether his reading is historically accurate. He shifted the conversation. For 25 centuries, philosophers had been asking, was Parmenides logically right? Heidegger asked a different question. What was Parmenides actually talking about, not being as a concept to be debated? Being as an experience to be had, not a proof on a blackboard, a thing that happens to you when you stop thinking about existence and start existing. The difference between knowing that the sun is a star and standing in sunlight with your eyes closed. And it turned out that Heidegger's question, what if Parmenides was describing something real about the nature of reality, had been waiting for physics to catch up. In the 20th century, something happened that no one, not the defenders, not the attackers, not the escape artists, could have predicted. Physics started agreeing with Parmenides. Not metaphorically, not in some loose, poetic sense, in the equations. The philosopher Karl Popper, one of the most important thinkers in the philosophy of science, once had a conversation with Albert Einstein, and in that conversation Einstein gladly accepted a title. He called himself the Parmenidean. Popper recorded this in his book The Open Universe, published in 1982, though the conversation had taken place decades earlier. Einstein wasn't joking, he wasn't being coy, he meant it. And he had reason to mean it, because Einstein's theory of relativity, specifically the special theory published in 1905 and the general theory published in 1915, did something strange to time. It showed that time isn't what you think it is. In everyday experience, time flows. There's the past which is gone, the present which is happening now, the future which hasn't happened yet. We move through time the way we move through a hallway, one direction, one moment at a time, always forward. That's what it feels like. That's what it has always felt like. But relativity says that's an illusion. In Einstein's framework, past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. They're all equally real. The distinction between now and then isn't a feature of the universe, it's a feature of your perspective. Two observers moving at different speeds will disagree about what's happening now, and neither of them is wrong. Now isn't an objective feature of reality. It's relative to where you're standing and how fast you're moving. You take this seriously, and most physicists who work with relativity do arrive at what's called the block universe. A four-dimensional space-time block in which every event that has ever happened or will ever happen exists at once. Your birth is in there. Your death is in there. This moment right now is in there. They all coexist like pages in a book that's already been written. You're not reading the book one page at a time because the pages are being produced as you go. The pages were always there. You're just turning them. Or think of it like a film reel. Every frame is there. The whole movie exists, start to finish, laid out simultaneously. The love scene and the funeral and the credits and the opening shot all there at once. Nothing is being added to the reel. Nothing is being erased. The experience of watching the movie, the feeling of one frame giving way to the next, the sense that things are happening is something your consciousness does, not something the reel does. The physicist Hermann Weyl captured this vision in 1949, and his description is haunting. He wrote, "The objective world simply is, it does not happen. Only to the gaze of my consciousness, crawling along the lifeline of my body, does a section of this world come to life as a fleeting image in space which continuously changes in time." Read that again. The objective world simply is, it does not happen. That's Parmenides. That is almost word for word what the goddess said 25 centuries earlier. Being simply is, it does not change, it does not happen. The appearance of happening is a product of consciousness, your consciousness, crawling along your lifeline, experiencing one cross-section at a time and mistaking the sequence for time itself. Einstein knew this, that's why he accepted the title. He understood that his physics had arrived, through mathematics and experiment, at the same place Parmenides had arrived through pure thought inside a poem. But it went deeper than Einstein. In 1967, two physicists, John Wheeler and Wheeler-DeWitt, derived an equation that was supposed to be the ultimate description of reality. An equation for the quantum state of the entire universe, not part of the universe, all of it, every particle, every field, every interaction, captured in a single mathematical expression. And when they wrote the equation down, something was missing: time. The Wheeler-DeWitt equation contains no time variable. There's no t, there's no before or after. The equation doesn't describe a universe that evolves. It describes a universe that simply exists. A static mathematical object, complete and unchanging, containing all configurations of matter and energy at once. This is called the problem of time in quantum gravity, and it remains one of the deepest unsolved puzzles in all of physics. Physicists have been arguing about it for nearly 60 years. Some think time is emergent. It somehow arises from more fundamental timeless processes, the way temperature arises from the motion of molecules even though no individual molecule has a temperature. Others think the equation is incomplete, that something is missing from the formalism, but the equation works. It produces correct predictions, and it has no time in it. If the most fundamental description of reality has no time, if the deepest equation simply doesn't mention change, then where does our experience of change come from? Why does the universe seem to evolve if the equation that describes it is static? That question, that exact question, is structurally identical to the question Parmenides posed. If being is motionless and eternal, where does the appearance of motion come from? If reality doesn't change, why does it look like it does? 25 centuries apart, different languages, different methods, different cultures, different everything. A Greek mystic poet and a pair of quantum physicists, and the same impossible question, sitting at the bottom of everything, refusing to go away. The goddess said being simply is. It does not happen. The equation says the universe has no time variable. It does not evolve. and in between, 25 centuries of human effort to rescue the reality of change from a proof that says change doesn't exist. But the physics had one more echo in store, and this one was stranger than all the others. There's a phenomenon in quantum mechanics named after Parmenides' student Zeno, and it's one of the strangest things science has ever confirmed. It's called the quantum Zeno effect, and it goes like this. In quantum mechanics, particles in unstable states will eventually decay. A radioactive atom will emit a particle and become something else. That's just what unstable things do. They change, except when you watch them. If you observe an unstable quantum particle frequently enough, measure it, check on it, look at it, it won't decay. It stays exactly as it is. The act of measurement collapses the particle back into its original state, resetting the clock. Watch it closely enough, and it never changes at all. This was first theorized by Misra and Sudarshan in 1977. For years it was treated as a theoretical curiosity, a mathematical consequence of quantum formalism that seemed too strange to be real. And then in 2001, it was experimentally confirmed. You can actually freeze a quantum particle in place by watching it. Observation prevents change. The nomming wasn't accidental. Physicists called it the Zeno effect because it echoed exactly what Parmenides and Zeno had argued 2,500 years earlier. That change is an illusion, that motion is somehow not what it seems, that the world's apparent dynamism masks a deeper stillness. The ancient intuition that watching things closely enough reveals that they don't actually move, that was supposed to be a philosophical provocation, a paradox. It wasn't supposed to be experimentally verified. And then there's Julian Barbour. Barbour is a British physicist who published a book in 1999 called The End of Time, and its argument is as stark as the title suggests. Time doesn't exist. Not time isn't what you think it is, or time is relative. Time doesn't exist, period. In Barbour's framework, the universe is not a process unfolding through time. It's a vast collection of what he calls nows, each one a complete, static configuration of all the matter and energy in the universe. Each now is whole, each now is self-contained, they don't flow into each other, they don't succeed each other. They simply exist all at once in a timeless mathematical space he calls Platonia. Your experience of time, the feeling that one moment gives way to the next, that things change, that the past is gone and the future hasn't arrived is, in Barbour's view, a feature of how the nows are structured, not evidence that they're actually happening in sequence. Each now contains within it the appearance of a past, memories, records, traces, but those traces don't prove that a past actually occurred. They're just features of the configuration. Like finding a fossil, the fossil doesn't prove that time passed. It's just a pattern in the rocks. And here's what makes Barbour especially significant for this story. He explicitly frames his work as a return to Parmenides. He cites Parmenides by name. He acknowledges that his physics is, in its deepest structure, a modern version of the ancient insight that each moment is whole and complete in itself, that reality doesn't flow, that being simply is. A modern physicist, writing in 1999, using equations and observational data, and arriving at the same conclusion as a Greek mystic poet writing in hexameter verse 25 centuries ago, citing that poet as his ancestor. There's something almost eerie about it, as if the argument refused to die, no matter how many times philosophy and science tried to bury it. But here's the deepest turn, the one that sits at the very bottom of everything Parmenides said. His argument was about language and thought. You can't think of what doesn't exist. You can't speak of nothingness without making it something. Non-being is unthinkable, unspeakable, impossible to even point at without giving it a kind of existence. But look at what happens when you try to make that argument. To say non-being does not exist, you have to use the words non-being. You have to think about it. You have to hold it in your mind long enough to deny it. Every sentence that says nothingness is nothing conjures the very thing it's trying to eliminate. The denial of non-being requires non-being to be present as a concept, as a word, as an object of thought in order to be denied. Parmenides' proof that nothingness is unthinkable is itself a thought about nothingness. The argument undermines itself at the very moment it succeeds. Plato noticed this, Heidegger noticed this. The French philosopher Jacques Derrida noticed this and built an entire philosophical method around it. Parmenides' argument may be the first example in human history of a philosophical claim that cannot be stated without contradicting itself, a proof that is true and self-refuting at the same time. And maybe that's the most Parmenidean thing of all. The argument that nothing can change is itself unstable. The proof of eternal stillness can't stop moving. Every time you say it, it undermines itself. Every time it undermines itself, you say it again. It goes on like that forever. Which is exactly what Parmenides said reality does. It goes on, unchanged, forever. The argument contradicts itself. The physics keeps confirming it. And here you are, lying still, listening to words that change one into the next, inside a body that Parmenides said isn't really changing at all. So here's where we are. A man wrote a poem 2,500 years ago. In that poem, a goddess told him that change is impossible, that reality is a single, motionless sphere, whole and complete and eternal. Every philosopher who came after him tried to prove him wrong. Some found workarounds, some found loopholes, some committed patricide. None of them entirely succeeded. And then in the 20th and 21st centuries, the most advanced physics on Earth started arriving at the same conclusion through mathematics and experiment. Time disappears from the deepest equations. Observation freezes change. A physicist writes a book called The End of Time and cites Parmenides as his ancestor. The argument that was supposed to be the most absurd claim in the history of philosophy keeps turning out to be the most persistent. And now it's your turn, because the argument isn't about Parmenides or Zeno or Einstein or Wheeler-DeWitt. It's about you, right now, in this moment. Parmenides described reality as a perfect, motionless sphere. And here you are, a breathing, blinking, aging creature, listening to these words change one into the next. Your chest is rising and falling. Your thoughts are shifting. The voice carrying these words into your ears is vibrating air molecules that weren't vibrating a moment ago. Everything about this moment is different from the moment before it. Or is it? Either Parmenides was wrong and everything you experience is exactly what it seems. The sunrise you watched this morning happened. Your heartbeat is real. The feeling of time passing is an accurate report of something that's actually occurring. Change is real, motion is real, and a Greek poet 25 centuries ago made an interesting but ultimately incorrect argument that the world has moved past. Or he was right. And the sunrise didn't happen, and your heartbeat isn't real. And the voice carrying these words into your ears, none of it is actually occurring. You are not changing. You have never changed. The feeling of change is a trick your consciousness plays on a reality that sits perfectly, eternally still. You are not becoming anything. You are not losing anything. You are not moving through time from one moment to the next. You are the whole sphere. You have always been the whole sphere, complete, motionless, unchanging. You are the stranger who has always been you. And there's nothing you need to do about any of this tonight. The question will still be there in the morning, if morning is the kind of thing that actually arrives. For now, it's enough to lie still, to notice the breath moving in and out of a body that may or may not be changing, to feel the weight of a question that's older than almost every other question humans have ever asked. Does anything actually change? No one has answered it yet, not in 2,500 years, and maybe that's because the answer isn't the point. Maybe the point is the question itself, the way it opens something up, the way it makes you look at the most obvious thing in the world and wonder whether it's actually happening. The wheels of the chariot have stopped turning. The gate of justice stands open. The goddess has spoken. And the stillness is all that remains. We started with the most obvious thing in the world, that things change, and spent the last 2 hours watching that certainty dissolve. Not into nothing, into something stranger, a possibility that logic and physics keep circling back to, no matter how many times philosophy tries to put it away. That's what mind folded is, for folding familiar ideas until they show you a side you hadn't noticed. There's always more to look at, and we'll be here whenever you want to look again.